Welcome to the Harvest 2020 Spot Farm Results Week. The live stream session will start shortly. Before we begin, we want to remind you of some housekeeping. You will stay muted throughout the live session, so we can't hear you. The session is scheduled to be either 1 or 1.5 hours long, including questions. To ask the speakers a question, use the stage chat found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do not ask questions for the live session in the main events chat. This session will be recorded and will be available to watch again on the AHDB Potatoes YouTube channel and the AHDB website. At the end of the session, we will provide you with a unique basis and Naroso code, which you should keep note of for each session that you attend. Don't forget to apply for points using the basis and Naroso application forms, which can be found in the reception area. Join the conversation online by following AHDB Potatoes on Twitter and use the hashtag SpotFarmResults2020. Finally, if you have any issues with the conference platform, contact the team on events@ahdb.org.uk. We hope that you enjoy the Harvest 2020 Spot Farm Results Week. Your session will now start.
Welcome and good morning to everyone. So I'm Alex Wade, Knowledge Exchange Manager for the West Midlands, South West and Wales. Today the session will be on reducing the threat of aphids in a potato crop, and the purpose is to discuss the work done with AHDB at two spot farms, Spot Scotland and Spot East, and what we found, and I welcome you all watching today. So our speakers are Graham Tomalin from BCS Agronomy, who was the agronomist involved in the aphid work at Spot East, Mike Shapland from the Spot East site, James Foskett Farms based at Bromswell near Woodbridge, and then finally Jim Reid, our Spot Farm Scotland host, Milton of Mathers, who grows 80 hectares of seed potatoes. Now, as we all know, aphids pose a massive threat to both seed and potato crops, particularly with the loss of certain actives in our insecticide armoury. So careful management and new ways of controlling / reducing aphids must be looked into. Now I won't go into too much on the work that's been done in Spot East right now, as we have a video for you all to watch shortly, which will explain the background. But I'll start with Spot Scotland work and our host Jim Reid. Now, Jim grows seed potatoes, so aphids being a priority. And with AHDB, Jim has investigated some interesting work involving, firstly, cover crops and flower mixes drilled in between the potato rows and around the potato crop. And the reason for this and the theory behind it here is to attract beneficials as well as attract the aphids, and in turn cleans their stylet, which reduces the impact of the virus as well as harbouring the beneficials. Now, from this work, there hasn't been massive statistical results. However, it's some of work of interest. And Jim, I'd like you to talk to us firstly a little bit about the challenges you face as a seed grower in terms of aphids, and what led you to the work with the cover crops / flower strips.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the goalposts have been shifted completely for seed growers because of the applications of the neonics and Tapiti. So there's no such thing as a dual purpose crop now. You either have a weir crop or a seed crop. The work that we've done is similar to what Brendan Rocky has done in Canada, and it was Eric Anderson from Scottish Agronomy that was able to put it all together. We have got some results that will be published from the Game Conservancy trusts of the predators that were there, and the whole IPM approach of it sounds as if it will be a help to seed growers. At the moment, we've got insist that we use twice in the programme in Tapiti. So we have also used mineral oil up to 30% emergence if there is pressure at the beginning, that we can use right up to tuber initiation at about 2 or 3% of the volume. To begin with, the SASA weren't too happy about it, but they accept that now because it, obviously the leaves are shiny. The crop looks slightly different with the mineral oil, but it gives us an extra natural thing to use. It'll be easier when we plant the seed from that field this year, is just to see how effective it's been. But with the tuber tests that have been done, there doesn't look to be any problem with tuber virus. And it actually makes the field look good. The cover crops in the middle to attract the predators. We see cereals around the outside of the crop, as you said, to empty their stylus before they enter the potato crop. And it's really, we're going to have to wait until this season until we see the effect, the full effect of that.
In terms of the strips, with the soil and water erosion being a big concern to growers, do you feel that did you have a look at sort of how they worked in terms of preventing runoff in the tram lines and on the headlands? Did you notice anything there?
I think there are some growers of sowing their tram lines with it, but if you're going to sow the tram line with it, then obviously you're going to be spraying that as well. So there's not going to be any predators in it. So the way that we laid out the field was that the strips were in between different crops as well, but it was all done to sprayer width. Aphids actually, even, we can have 4 or 5 varieties in the same field, and obviously there's a blank bed between each. And that change of colour is something that pulls the aphids in. That's why, you often have higher virus off headlands and that strip that's between different varieties. So if we're able to sow a crop in the middle of each variety, then that should be better. But I would like to say that I think it is better if it's unsprayed, obviously.
Yeah. And then moving on a little, Jim, another thing you looked at was the link to your desiccation and blackleg work, which was the importance of managing regrowth after desiccation and transmission into the next season. So, I think a lot of people after final desiccation forget about regrowth, which was the case with dicot, but now with your other chemical alternatives, crops take longer to kill and regrowth is more common. So there's that important window there, isn't there, where aphids can transmit and actually almost devalue the whole crop without growers realizing. So again, could you tell us a little bit about that work and what you did to minimize that risk?
I'm smiling. It wasn't funny at the time, but 2 seasons ago, the first year that we did the desiccation trials for AHDB, we used quite a bit of pelargonic acid, and where the pelargonic acid was used on its own, it was very slow, and we actually ended up going in with some dicot just to finish it off. And the flail treatments had regrowth in them again, which was sprayed off. Now, because we retain 1 ton out of the 12 different treatments that we use, we'll plant that ton in the field. So as soon as we came out of the commercial crop, where there was absolutely no leaf roll at all, as soon as we went into treatment 1, which was the field treatment, was clean. And then we went into the next treatment, and oh my word, I haven't seen leaf roll for 20 years. So there was varying degrees, and all this information will be published. Varying degrees of leaf roll within these crops that were slow to go down. So SASA were involved as well. John Ellicott came up and had a look at it. So, we always worry about an ingress of virus at the beginning when they come through the ground, but it's equally, it can come in at the end too with regrowth, so it is important.
And from those findings, Jim, are you, what are you doing in terms to stop? Are you doing an extra pass of desiccation, or are you going in later when the crop almost looks like it's pretty much dead? Are you going in with a another desiccation?
Well, we're non-flail, so we've taken a 3-spray approach, which, you know, like I said, the commercial treatment from 2018-19 was as clean as a whistle. There was no leaf roll in it at all. So, you know, it's important that green material's taken down as quick as possible. So that's what we do. We do a 3. So we do have an extra spray since we lost dipole.
Yeah. Jim, that's some interesting things, and you know, I'd love to talk to you a bit longer about that, but we'll get into a few more questions later about what you found and some more questions, but because of time restraints now, we'll move on to Spot East and a video from there that will explain the background to the trials.
So I'm Graham Tomalin, I work for VCS Potatoes, and this year we've got a replicated trial which is in association with VCS UK, who are doing the applications. What we're doing here with the trial this year, we're particularly looking at virus reduction in seed. Foskett Farms are large seed growers in East Suffolk and have been growing seed now for a number of years, and virus is our biggest challenge year on year, growing certified seed. So what we're looking at is a replicated trial with 4 replicates, looking at alternative methods in conjunction with current insecticides to try and reduce the transmission of virus into the seed. 2019 virus was one of the big issues in the industry, and that was on the back of 2018 being a very hot, dry season and virus levels in the seed being greater than we would have in a normal year, which in 2019 affected the ware crops. So this is why we want to look at virus transmission and ways of reducing virus transmission, particularly in England where we have had historically higher virus levels. We particularly want to look at all options to reduce virus transmission to seed crops. We are seeing climate change and some effects. Yes, we said 1 in 8 years in what we had in 2018, which led to the issues in crops in 2019. But this year is another hot, dry year in England, and we've seen the higher aphid levels than we've seen for a number of years, and I suspect there will be virus within seed. The basis of the trial is replicated 4 times. How we've set the trial out, we use pre-basic Maris pear seed for the trial, which is known to have 0 virus. So that was planted within the middle of a ware crop, which had very low levels of virus. That was tested at 1%. So we had a low source of infection. Evenly around the plots, we planted infector plants that were 3 beds away. So we had a slightly higher source of infection in case it was a little bit too low this year. The plots were only 2 plots wide, so it was an even infection either side of the plots. We chose Maris pear because in the area, Maris pear is widely grown. It's also widely purchased as seed, and some growers grow their own seed in the area. Also, seed is purchased from Scotland and England. The reason to use Maris pear is a variety that has issues with virus. It's quite susceptible to virus and will easily transmit virus into the crop. Through the trial, then, we're looking at the treatments that we did. So we had standard insecticide program, and then in addition to standard insecticide, we added oils to the standard insecticide program. We then also had another treatment which was adding oils to the standard and having oils in between, so we were actually spraying the plots every 3 to 4 days. And on that treatment at the moment we can see phytotoxicity, but not on the standard just oils added into the insecticide. 2 adjuvants as well we're looking at, which are supposed to improve the performance of insecticides that we're applying. So they're with the standard insecticide program. In addition to that, there's a couple of novel products as well that we're looking at, and a potential new insecticide that may be approved in the near future, which will control resistant aphids as well. But that's also in there in combination with a program. So it's not looking at it on its own, we're looking at it in a combination with a current program that we can use. The main outcome of the trial will be the virus results from the trial. So we'll take 100 tubers from each of the plots, have them indexed, and then we'll have a virus results. We'll be using the standard grow-on test rather than the rapid test because it seems to give more consistent results and it's more cost-effective as well. Within this trial, we're using products right through to monitor the performance rather than just at TI, but we will wait approval for these products obviously before we can use the products widespread. Colonising aphids really are those which will feed and multiply on a potato crop, whereas a non-colonising will move in through the environment, might feed on the crop for a while, but won't actually multiply on the crop. They'll then move on. Willow carrot aphid is normally in this area, we've seen massive spikes of willow carrot aphid first, and that's been linked into transmission of virus early, and then we get minimise comes in later. So I think it's combined. If you look at the work that FIRA have done on willow carrot, it's not as effective as minimise for transmitting PVY, but it's 50% as effective. The aphids pretty well have gone now. There's been a big pickup in predators, and the aphid levels, or particularly colonising aphids, have declined dramatically. There's always the possibility of virus transmitting in through the crop all the way through its growing period, but also through the desiccation period. And that may be more of an issue now we've lost dicot, that the desiccation period will be longer. So all the time the crop is green, there will be a risk of virus transmission into the crop. However, crops are less likely to get virus. It can get in, but it's less likely to get into the crop when the crop is maturer, particularly with PVYO. Although some of the data with PVYN suggests it still is likely to get into crop. It's definitely the most susceptible time is early in the plant's growth. Small plants, very sort of fresh plants, and that's the time it's most likely to move into the plants. If you've got PVY or YN, you'll see it in the crop. From the seed, you'll actually see that in the crop. There are levels that we will actually plant and specifically plant at certain times. So it's not a zero virus we can cope with, but it's a low level we can cope with. With PVY-NTN, you can get necrotic ring symptoms within tubers on set skin crops. Well, we've got a number of insecticide options available, though they're ever reducing. We still have neonics this year, so we've got Biscaya, and Insist is the other neonic which we will still have next year, but we're only allowed 2 applications on seed combined of the 2 products. In addition to that, we've got Topiki flonomycid, but that is only used for seed and isn't allowed to be used for wear. And then we can use the pyrethroids, but there's widespread resistance to the pyrethroids amongst the aphid population, particularly of Mysis persicae. PVY virus, which is the one we're mainly concerned about, the aphids carry it on their mouth parts. When they start to feed, they'll transmit that virus to the plants. The idea of mineral oils is to actually affect the feeding. It doesn't control the aphids themselves. The aphids carry it on their mouth parts. When they start to feed, they'll transmit that virus to the plants. It's thought that the oil prevents them or stops them feeding, and they don't particularly like to feed through the layer of oil. That's the reason that we feel that it gives a reduction in virus transmission. It's quite distinctive, the phytotoxicity. It's different to virus in a crop, so you can see the difference. Probably the in-between spray maybe is more than we need, but we'll find out when we get the results from the trial. There is a concern, certainly from the inspection side, but there seems to be no issues abroad, and they're using high levels of oil abroad. So this leaf here shows some of the subtle phytotoxic effects from oil applications every 3 days. The veinal darkening where the oil builds up on the veins after each application. Beneficials certainly a help in wear crops, and in wear crops in an average year we'd probably treat 20 to 30%, and the beneficials, you get a rapid increase with the beneficials which wipe out most aphids very quickly. In terms of seed crops, I think beneficials, they may help earlier in the season, but where you're looking to control aphids before they have a chance to feed in crops, the control has to be quick. I think the yellow water traps really capture the population that's moving into the field. If you've got a reasonable insecticide program, you're really capturing those winged aphids that are moving in from outside the environment. So you then get to know the populations that will potentially be there, and the ones which will actually multiply on your crop. Some will multiply and some will just move in but will not feed on the crop, but will not multiply on the crop. On the trial site we had recordings up to 70 Mysis early on. It was very early Mysis flight this year. In traps that I work in the Suffolk area, I had up to 400 Mysis in 1 week, which is much higher. Normally we'd be, at the highest week, we'd be 60, maybe even 40. So it's a very high early peak this year, which means virus transmission is going to be a real risk this year. Standard for growing at James Foskett Farms is the first target is to buy the best input stocks that we can obtain for the varieties we want to grow. I think it's the best way to reduce risk of virus transmission is to not have virus in the field in the first place. In combination with that, so most of the input stocks are pre-basic, PB3 or S4. In combination with that, we look for isolation. So most of the seed fields are isolated from the ware production in this area. And then in combination with that, we use aphicide treatments through the season, right from 80% emergence of the crop, and at maximum interval will be weekly. In terms of ware growers and the route I would go, it's know your seed supplier. Ideally, if you're worried about the seed, ideally ask for a virus test on the seed, or look into the inspection reports, ask for the inspection reports to see whether there was virus in the seed crop, so what levels of virus were in the seed crop initially. That might not give you the final level of virus that's in the crop because there's transmission, but if there was virus there at inspection, then it's likely that will have multiplied during the crop. So as much information as you can get regarding your seed crop is vital for the ware growers. Without a doubt, there's a lot to learn on viruses, and it's the combination of viruses as well that we need to learn about. It's not just the expression that some varieties will express PVY or YN greater or lesser extent, but then if you add in X or V or S, if you add the combination, are you going to get a greater effect in the crop or not? And with newer varieties, we have less knowledge about how they form, both in canopy or in terms of tubers and growth cracking, which we know is linked into some viruses. There are some varieties out there which can grow absolutely fine with a level of virus. So although we're trying to keep virus down in varieties that we know we have issues, such as Maris pear on this trial, there are other varieties where there's a level which we would be able to grow with. But generally those newer varieties, we don't have enough information yet to know what levels are acceptable and not. There's been some debate if it's low blight pressure, would you just put insecticide? Generally, if we're on a standard program and we're every 7 days, we'd be putting a blight program in with the insecticide. Only when we go down to really short intervals would we consider having insecticide on its own. Problem is, if you go from 7, you could be up to 14, and then you're quite a wide interval then.
Lovely. I think that's given some good background and understanding to the work done at Spot East. And now we will hear from Graham Tomalin, who was the agronomist for the work and the star of the video. So over to Graham.
Morning, everybody. I'm just going to set up the share screen. Hopefully everybody can see that now. All right, so yeah, morning. Ever since 2018, virus has really come back across the whole of Europe as being a major issue. It's been there. Prior to that, it was still an issue, but PVY in particular, since 2018, hot, dry summer has been a major issue. Followed on with 2019, you could see it in the ware crops, and 2020, we've had very high levels of aphids again, although virus levels in seed are not as high as I expected in the tests I've had. So I'm going to go through a little bit of background with PVY, and then I'm going to discuss some of the trial that we had this year down at Spot East. So just a bit of background with potato virus in the UK. PVY is amongst the other varieties of non-persistent potty viruses, PVY, PVA, PVV. But PVY is a severe mosaic virus, and you see these symptoms. This is a PVYN in Maris pear on the right, and whereas the others are very mild symptoms. In addition, other viruses we have in the UK, PVS, which also can be aphid transmission, but also contact transmission. PVX is contact, so tractors or people walking through the crop can move the virus through the crop, but they're both mild viruses again. All of those are non-persistent, or the PVY is non-persistent virus, i.e. it's not carried on aphids it's carried on aphid stylets, but is not within aphids. A persistent virus is potato virus leaf roll, which means the aphid has to feed for a long time to transmit that to another plant, so 2 to 3 hours. In addition, if we're going through the viruses, we ought to mention there's tobacco rattle virus sprang, which is a nematode transmission, and mop top virus sprang, which is a powdery scab transmission. So we're not just looking at aphids. So why is potato virus Y an issue? Well, the first factor is yield loss. There's been estimates on yield loss, and approximately, if you speak to Adrian Fox, it's 1% per percent of virus. But that depends on many factors. Which strain of virus have you got? Have you got PVYO/C, which may be more severe in terms of the yield loss because you get greater effects, or PVYM, which might be a touch milder? But that is very varietal. Some varieties can take it very well and still produce good yields. I mean, historically, we have varieties like Estima and varieties like Nectar, which seem to be able to carry the virus, PVY virus, and still produce good yields. So there's a factor there that will affect the yield loss. There's also the growing conditions of the crop. More severe or stressful growing conditions, I suspect you'll get a greater decrease in the yield per percent of virus. And then there's combinations of virus. Now, there's lots of areas here that we know not a lot about. So you've got the combination of variety, different viruses together in different varieties can cause lots of different effects. Then the other aspect is tuber quality, and mosaic symptoms in plants have been linked to tuber cracking. On the right here, there's a plant that I dug in 2018. And they were tested with PVYN. They have severe mosaic symptoms in them. And you can see here that the tubers from very early were getting tuber deformities. And this, when it grew on, carried on, and you see these cracking or slight deformity symptoms. Not all varieties will show, as I said, it's very varietal. This variety is obviously very susceptible to these symptoms. Other varieties would only crack very much later on in the season when the tubers are bigger. And again, if you get a stress, waterlogging, you might get more cracking if you've got virus and less if you haven't. The other aspect on tuber quality is PVY-NTN necrotic ring spot disorder. There's a picture here on the right. It's not, the crack there is not in the tuber, is not due to the virus. That's a harvest damage, but you can see the symptom there on the tuber. On both tubers there. Can be very significant in some viruses, but it's very varietal. Some varieties will not show this at all. Most varieties won't, but varieties like Maris Peer show it. There's other varieties that are even more significant, like Annabelle. When do they express these symptoms? There's a research paper in America with infection of a seed crop at different times. I think it was in pots. And the later the infection in a seed crop, then it's the later that you'll actually see these symptoms, or in the crop, later you'll see these symptoms in storage. With Maris Peer, it seems the virus has to build up to quite a level. So we generally, the percentage that we'll see in a crop is quite closely linked to the virus level of the seed stock that we have. Other varieties that are more susceptible, they can get primary infection in the season and you'll still see the symptoms. So the Spot Farm host, James Foskett Farms, we had the committee meeting, and we're really interested in PVY as a certified seed grower for more than 25 years. Potato virus Y is one of the biggest issues, combined with drier summers and yield variability. They're the two factors that affect seed production for James Foskett Farms. So why do we grow seed in England at higher risk of aphid and higher risk of virus transmission? Well, it's an advantage for our salad variety, and certainly at James Foskett Farms, we like to be able to produce chronologically older seed to increase stem numbers and then tuber numbers, which for Maris Peer and Charlotte can increase the tuber numbers and hence the yield of a salad fraction significantly. And the other aspects that we looked at, why we looked to grow our own seed, or why James started growing his own seed years ago, was blackleg risk with susceptible varieties. There's certainly a lower blackleg risk in the drier conditions that we've got in Suffolk. In So we looked at some of the parameters after issues in 2018. With Mike, we actually looked through some of the factors over a 4-year period, and Mike kindly said we can share some of this data as to where we were getting the worst issues. So one factor was the variety risk, and you can see here on the chart that where we had more susceptible varieties, such as Maris pear, we were getting a greater level of virus on average than where we had resistant varieties. There are varieties out there that are resistant, such as Melody, Sagita, and Carlingford, but there's a limit to the market. There's not that many varieties that are resistant to that sort of level. Those varieties are really useful, but there is a limit to how many. So we've got to learn to grow the other varieties that are more susceptible without getting too much virus. So then what were the next factors? So we also looked at location, isolation from wear crops and volunteers. And we just graded the fields where we felt they were either good or medium isolation from wear crops and from volunteers if we saw them in other crops. And yeah, when we ran the figures through the spreadsheet, yes, those that were better isolation on average had an improved performance on the PVY. But it's not just isolation from outside sources of PVY, it's also isolation from PVY within the field. It's really important. If you haven't actually got a source of PVY in the field, if you've got aphids, you still won't get transmission of PVY across the field. And it was quite clear when we did this that if you compare on the chart here, pre-basic seed, which is our selected seed from where we can get it from most of the input seed, and as you go down the scales of the seed production, the poorer you've got. We've got a chart bar on the right, which is home saved seed, and that's just, we don't use home saved seed for the seed production at James Foskett Farms, but if we have a wear crop that maybe has failed or an issue with scab, we might test it. So I put that into the spreadsheet, and it was quite interesting. As you'd expect, virus level was higher. So this confirms our policy of working on higher grade input stocks. So the other aspect we looked at was date of planting, and we try and target early planting for the stem numbers and tuber numbers, and on all the 4 years that we assessed, early and middle of the season planting was definitely better than late planting. I would say this year it might have been a different matter. We haven't got 2020. The aphid flight was very early. But the reason earlier planting works, if you go through that phase of rosette stage to full canopy before there is large aphid flights, then you might get some mature plant resistance. So to some of the viruses, you get to this mature plant resistance to aphid ingress into the plant. And also with a lot of this work with straw mulch and covers, if we get in a canopy cover quicker, we might get less aphids actually lighting on the plants themselves when the aphids are there if we've got a full canopy. So for me, the trial work or the work we were looking at, all what we've spoke about before is really important, but what we're going to look at is how we can reduce aphid levels within the crop or reduce feeding of the aphids within crops. Bit of background on 2020 in East Anglia, massive pressure. Now, this is courtesy of FERA and the AHDB yellow water traps. This is East Anglian pressure, and you can see 2020 in comparison to the yellow line, in comparison to the blue line, there was significant pressure. So this is an index of pressure, so it's over 500 as an average of the whole of East Anglia. So the trial we had, we placed the trial amongst a wear crop, because to place a virus reduction trial of this size amongst a seed crop would put a risk to the seed crop if we're planting infectors around it. So we had to look at a wear situation. The trial site was near Woodbridge. The variety was Maris pear. We replicated it 4 times. Planting date was 14th of April. And the other dates there, desiccation date 2nd of July, and then we sampled for virus on the 14th and 18th of August. So looking at the trial here, this is just post-planting. Within the trial area, we planted a high-grade Scotch PB3 stock. We also tested the stock, and it came out with 0 virus in the tests. We planted infector rows. They weren't immediately adjacent. I'll show that in a second. So the infector rows were an actual certified seed that had failed, not from James Foskett Farms, from another source, which had 18% PVY and 11% YN. Of that 18%, 11% was PVYN. The ware crop around was another source of seed. That was certified seed that had been tested, ELISA tested to 0, but there were very low levels, below 1% levels within that seed as well. Looking at the programs we looked at, so we had untreated, standard insecticide program, which I'll show in a minute, and then there were variations on the standard insecticide or additions to the standard insecticide. So we added an oil at 6.25 litres, oil at half rate. This is to 6 applications. We had oil at half rate, and we had oil added to the standard insecticide. So that was the only treatment where we weren't 7 days, where we're actually coming down to 3/4 days. But we were effectively doubling up or increasing the frequency of oil applications. Then we looked at standard insecticide plus a banker, which is an adjuvant that's got a lot of data behind it to improve the insecticides. A couple of experimental adjuvants, new aphicide, standard insecticide plus flipper, and a novel repellent. All of the plots had a standard blight program that's on the left, or a blight program that we proceed to use that's on the left hand side, avoiding any of the blight sprays that could cause phytotoxicity with oil, so no fluazinam, no ramman. The picture on the right, that was the day of the first application. At the top, it was about 80% emergence. Towards the bottom of the trial, it was more 50% emergence. So the standard insecticide program that we used here was a pyrethroid every application, alternating between Hallmark and Sven. And then the insecticide, the second insecticide which was added, was in cyst at fortnightly gap, 2 applications, and Topeki, again 2 applications at fortnightly gap. Just a little bit of data, read some of the treatments. Banker, this was data that was kindly sent over from Interagro, but I know there's been a lot of work in Holland with regard to Banker, and the last 3 years have had statistical data showing an improvement of the performance of, in this case, Sumi alpha, which is S-fen valerate, same as Sven, pyrethroid, and you include Banker, you can see there's statistical differences there to the untreated. One of the other treatments, Flipper, is a bioinsecticide. It's got a wide range now of off-label or EMUs approvals, not potatoes at present. It's got a very good phytotox or lack of toxicity against beneficials and bees, so maybe of interest. In this trial, we used it with pyrethroids, but in future, maybe on its own if it gains approval. But it is contact active, and coverage is absolutely essential. Most aphids are on the underside of leaves, so it's a challenge to get application to the aphids to provide control. So looking at the design trial plan here, we had 4 blocks, which were the replicates down the center of the trial there. Each of the plots were 3 beds wide. We had them just 2 plots wide, because then we got the infectors, which are in purple there, which were 3 beds away. A single row of infector plants were equidistant away from all plots within the trial to try and get an even pressure of infection. So there you can see that the 2 blocks were adjacent, and there's the infector plots as I spoke about in the pink rows on the side. And then around that we had the field crop, which was tested at 0 PVY. So when we actually came to virus sampling, we tested the center bed of the 3 beds that we planted with the high-grade seed to try to avoid outside cross infection from any of the other treatments or anything else. So there when we did the testing, we're sampling, we were taking 100 tubers from 100 different plants within that center bed. So every tuber was from a different plant. A few observations from one of the days where we were there at the trial site. You could see, certainly with repeated oil applications, I mean, it's quite interesting on some fields, you can see in the early morning, you can see water beading on the plants. You know when you put oil on a crop, you can see it. And just wanted to go through some of the pictures, but there's in the background, there's a little bit of top dressing fertilizer scorch. So I'm just pointing out fertilizer scorch on the untreated. So if you see that on some of the pictures, it's fertilizer, not any other actions. So this shows here clearly on an oil application. So this was 6.25 oil every 7 days. A lot more water beading there. So the oil is still there, and that's what you can see quite clearly right across the crop. But then you've got to go away from that. So where we actually applied more frequently, this was, the oil at 3.125 every time. And again, water beading was seen across the crop. You might say this is phytotoxicity. This is actually fertilizer scorch. Again, it's not phytotoxicity due to the oil. If I go though to the more repeated, so this was oil sprayed every 3 to 4 days. This was the only treatment where we did see phytotoxicity. Now I've marked it here with a purple circle, but you can actually see it right across the left-hand side of the slide there. You can see phytotoxic symptoms on the crop. But again, it's quite encouraging now in Scotland and in England. I think the inspectors have got a greater handle now on the phytotoxicity symptoms if these occur, and abroad they are okay with these symptoms, and it doesn't seem to be affecting certification the same as before if we're allowed to use oils to a greater degree than we can at the moment. So here again shows the plot on the left, so you can't really see it when you take a plot photo. Go in depth in the plot and you can actually see the phyto symptoms there on the right hand side. So there wasn't yield, or amongst the protocol, we didn't have yield for all the different treatments, but we did want to compare yield for the increased frequency of oil applications. So the standard oil applications, the yield was very similar to the standard insecticide, but when we went to the increased frequency, there was a yield drop there. I haven't got the stats on this at the moment, but when we get the full report through, we'll have the stats on that, and it's quite likely that will be a significant yield drop where we increase the frequency to 3-4 days. On there, it has to be noted, it was a very bright dry spring, and most of the applications occurred early morning because we were quite a windy season as well, so we were trying to get the applications on in good conditions. So whether the sun, the high solar radiation had an influence on the level of scorch that we saw, or phyto that we saw with the repeated oils. Aphid pressure on the site. The aphid pressure was very early on the site here. Unfortunately, we lost the first reading with the yellow water traps because of the effect of wind on the traps, but 26, that was 12 days after the first treatment, and we still had high levels of minimise, but it dropped down quickly. Also note willow carrot aphid, which is significant in our area, was the second highest there. And I've pulled the data and then pulled it with the East Suffolk traps that I was involved with, because the blue line on this chart was the traps on the actual site, and the dotted line is when we actually started spraying, when the crop was at 50 to 80% emergence. And you can see that the peak of aphids occurred sort of fairly closely after we started the trial. Just worked the percentage out of the index of the PVY index across East Anglia as an average and across our site. They were very similar. 85–89% of the index was minimus, 7 to 9% willow carrot. So that doesn't leave an awful lot for the remainder, 2 to 3% for the remainder of aphids. Coming to the results. Now, the unfortunate part, as in fact, got a really good trial. We got the aphids, got the timing right, but unfortunately the differences between the treatments were not as great as I expected. There is a wide range. We're still waiting for some results. There's quite a wide range of results for each of the treatments as well. So there'll be no statistical difference between the different treatments, which is disappointing when you get to the end of a trial like this and you get the results. However, speaking to Jane Thomas and looking back at some of the earlier work for AHDB in 2011, this has occurred in trials before, and looking at some of the work on the continent as well, they're not always good or good results. You would say, looking at the results, treatment 5 was the frequent oil applications, with the oil applications in between, and that was the lowest at the moment. It will not be significant, but was the lowest. So maybe there's a trend there that oil applications, as we believe, improve. Of the other treatments, Banker was the lowest of the adjuvants, and Flipper was a little bit lower than the untreated as well. So maybe indicating these had some effect. In terms of the PVY that was present, PVY was only tested split down in treatment 1 because there was a limited budget, and actually a lot of the PVY on this site was not PVYN, which was quite a surprise to me. Only 4% of the 31% was PVYN, and the remainder was PVYOC. There was a little bit of leaf roll as well on the site, which is surprising with some of the treatments, but there's no statistical data you can get back from the leaf roll that was there. So again, coming back to the results, no statistical difference. Trend towards treatment 5 improving, but only a trend. And it brings the question in itself: is a small plot trial the right approach for this sort of work? We follow the Loretto guidelines with the larger plots, in the centre, only taking tubers from the centre of the plots. But with a rapid build-up of aphids and a wear crop around, were the aphids just spreading over and actually swamping out all the treatment? So we actually got a very similar level of virus pressure. Also, looking into some more work with the mineral oils, it might be that mineral oils clean the stylet of the aphid before it then feeds on another plant. With no mineral oil on the surrounding wear crop and the infector crops, aphids would have been able to pick up the virus, and then as they moved on to the trial, even onto the oil plots, they may still have fed and still infected those oil plots, and then only clean the stylets off after they fed on those oil plots. So we've got to look, there's a hope within the committee that we'll do more virus work, because it's really important in our area. We always get the aphids, which is one thing, because one risk of these trials is you don't get the aphids and you don't get the virus. But it's fairly consistent that we will get the aphids. So where do we go from here? The questions that I ask myself: where do we go? Mineral oils benefit. What's the benefit? How best do we use them? Is there any benefit anymore of pyrethroids? Benefits and practicalities of straw mulch, alternative companion crops, resistant varieties on field margins, netting. It's expensive, but it is an option for high grade, and wildflower strips through the field. So I'll just come to a few of these. So currently mineral oils, there's no approved mineral oils beyond TI within the UK. And its use at the moment is limited to improving efficacy of the co-applied product. Technically, we shouldn't be applying mineral oils that we've got available at the moment as standalone applications. I don't think we need to prove mineral oils. You go back, and I've quoted a few different published research here. There's very good data on mineral oils reducing transmission, despite our trial this season not working. And I say I've put a few up here, right from 1966 through to the recent work from Dupuy in Switzerland, 2017. Very good evidence. The questions I would ask are, most applications within these trials are at 7 days. Are more frequent applications beneficial? And if you're going to do more frequent, you'd only really want to be hitting that real peak of aphid pressure. So is there a benefit there if you can time 2 or 3 extra applications in that peak period? And I don't think there's work to say whether there is or isn't at present. Next question is, are there any benefits of pyrethroids? You actually look, so I've pulled out the individual aphid data from on the right here from the fear of AHDB yellow water traps. And yes, this year the vast majority of the aphids were Mysis persicae, which is resistant, or most Mysis has got resistance to pyrethroid. And that was by far the most. Then you come back, the next one, willow carrot aphid, a lot of evidence of resistance again to pyrethroids. The only aphid that I found with significant numbers in East Anglia over the records was black bean aphid, which isn't resistant to pyrethroids. So if the majority of the time, or if we got water traps and we're catching Mysis and willow carrot, then we're not really seeing any benefit and maybe a disadvantage. If you're next to a field or somewhere where you're getting a lot of black bean aphid, then yes, you'll get an advantage. And some of that published research I mentioned a minute ago in Finland, black bean aphid is the most significant aphid there, and hence pyrethroids are still working there. So then moving on to a few more of the other alternatives we looked at, straw mulch and companion crops. It's believed that straw mulch or a companion crop will reduce the contrast when aphids are viewing crops emerging, reduce the contrast between the crop and the soil. And that may affect the aphids, the winged aphids actually landing on the crop. So there's very good evidence of this in a lot of the work, and there was presentations from the AHDB Agronomy Week pre-Christmas with Bruce Dupuis, which was really interesting work, and there's good evidence of the straw mulch reducing transmission. His earlier work, if you look at his paper, looked at companion crops as well, and there was good evidence and significant reductions with either oat or hairy vetch crops in 2011, 2012. So there's 2 options there. Straw mulch I see as being difficult. In terms of harvest of a potato crop in a wet season with straw mulch on the top of the beds, I see that could be a problem. So there are potential issues. Maybe a companion crop would be an easier way to go to look at. Oats or something that you could easily take out with herbicide, that may be an option. The reason they went away from that in the trial in Switzerland, or the work in Switzerland, was because the oats and hairy vetch were causing yield reductions because they were taking valuable moisture, and that would be an issue for us in East Anglia. It would have to be a short period for these crops. However, the crops rapidly produce full canopy cover, the potato crops, so you're only looking for a short period of cover crops. So I think these both warrant more work. Other options, resistant variety on field margin. I haven't seen any data. I would expect it would work. I've followed a similar approach with one seed grower that I work with, and this year it was relatively successful with using Sagita, and that seemed to be quite successful this year. However, it adds more complications, depends how many resistant varieties you're growing as well as a seed grower. But I think it warrants maybe a little bit more work. Aphid netting. I use aphid netting on organic crops, not potatoes, organic veg crops. It is effective, provided there aren't holes in the netting. It can be very effective, but it is very expensive. Only be an option, in my opinion, for high-grade seed. And then the other options to look at, wildflower margins and strips. Yes, I think there'll be a benefit, but there's still lots to learn. How close will the strips need to be? And the other important aspect, we've looked at it with carrots, with trying to get predators in organic crops. Do you really need to establish these strips the year before, so you've got a bank of predators there ready to go in the crop as the aphids emerge? So I'd like to thank team at VCS UK and VCS Potatoes, I'd like to thank James Foskett and AHDB for their help with this trial.
Thanks for that, Graham. It's very interesting. We're just a bit short on time now, so if any of the attendees do have to go, we'll drop the basis codes in the chat for you to get at a later point. But we'll just jump to some questions that have come in with everyone. If you've got the time, just to hang on for 10 or 15 minutes. But as I said, if you haven't, we'll drop the basis codes and that in the chat. So first off, Mike, hello. We just you were very involved with that work at Spot East. Just wondered from you, what did you learn from the work conducted, and how do you feel it went?
Well, yeah. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, as we've seen, it was a very comprehensive, well-conducted trial, and yeah, publicly just want to thank AHDB, Graham, and the team at VCS for all the effort they put into that. And it's disappointing when you don't get statistical results out of that. My personal view is that the early aphid numbers that we had, that very early build-up, particularly of mice, probably gave us that consistent level of infection across all the treatments, and agree with Graham's comments really in terms of having an ongoing source of infection from the ware crop around it. So it's obviously disappointing that we haven't got some really good differences between the treatments, but I think I'm passionate about this. It's a big problem for us, and it's something we really need to tackle. So I hope we, as Spot East, we're not discouraged, but we need to look at it and perhaps redesign what we do. But it's certainly something that we're going to continue with and continue to look at, because it's just so important.
Yeah, and in terms of looking forward, are you taking any practices learned into next season? Are you looking at more work on this?
Yeah, I think from our own practical on-farm practices, we've been using oils for quite a while now, and anecdotally, I think they do give us good efficacy. I think the big concern for the industry is how they're approved for use. Can we get their stage of application extended so that we can use them for longer in the season? I hadn't really appreciated that we've seen potential yield reductions from intensive oil use. So yeah, that's something we need to be a little bit wary of. Going back to some of Graham's initial comments in terms of, we're trying to source the highest possible grade of input stock with zero virus, keeping those generations as short as possible, because that for us is the key starting point. The other point for us really is isolation is a real challenge, to be honest, and we're aiming for maximum isolation. It's not always possible to know what your neighbours are doing, and sometimes that can compromise even the best laid plans. I think the other thing is we've got a lot of potato growing in this area, have done historically, and volunteers are a big issue for us, to be honest. And I think volunteer control is something as a sector we probably need to improve on, really. And I think the other point, really, from my point of view, is applying insecticides on a regular basis to seed potato crops is something that we do. I view it as a necessary evil. It's not something I think I'll look back on my agricultural career and be particularly proud of. So I'm heartened that the industry is now taking a more integrated approach to this challenge, if you like, and heartened to see what Jim and Eric have been doing. But I think as an industry, we've got to tackle this a different way. What we're doing at the moment isn't the answer, in my opinion. Personally, I think long term the answers lie with plant breeding as a big part of the solution, and making use of what we observe in varieties that don't express virus or resistant to virus. But in the interim, then we've got to have some other more integrated approaches.
Yeah, no, I agree. And moving on to Jim now. I know you've covered parts of this, but to sort of round up what you learned from the work, and following on from that, particularly on the cover crop aphid work, your plans moving forward to make it commercially sit in the system?
We'll be doing much the same this season. We'll put cereals round the outside of the field and the cover crops across the field again. We are going. I'm looking down the row of questions. We are going to be looking at straw mulch. One I've sent in were aphid monitoring results. I'm not sure if you can show them or not, but
yeah, we'll bring those up now.
The three traps that were in the field were only about 150 metres apart, and I didn't really notice until the end of the season. There were differences between the traps, but trap A was actually right beside the AHDB desiccation trials, so that trap was actually sitting in black ground, where the other two traps were within the cover crops. And if it doesn't come up, we had a total for the season of 37 peach potato aphids in trap A, but there was only 8 in trap B and 7 in trap C for the whole season. So, I would suggest that you don't want to have any bare ground in the field. But that's just an observation. So definitely, as Mike says, as an industry, we've got to try and look at different ways of doing this, and it is, it's definitely environmentally friendly. Should we be using pyrethroids? When you see everybody can see the data for the predators and the Game Conservancy Trust stuff. You'll see that there is a high number of predators in these strips. It's just how often should they be replicated across the field? There you go.
Here we
so
are.
This trap A was that was right next to the AHDB trials. And as I say, it was sprayed off just for access to the trials. So that was sitting on just a bare piece of land, where the other two, if you scroll up, you'll get trap B and trap C. They were within the cover crops between the blocks. Can we scroll that up?
No, I think.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So that trap C had 7 of a total for the season. And down a little bit, you'll see that trap B only had 6. So there's definitely, I know it's not a replicated thing or anything like that, but they were only 200 metres apart in a 40-hectare field.
Yeah, 30 versus 7. That's quite some numbers, isn't it? So, just moving on to some questions from the audience now, and we'll start with Graham. Using mineral oil seems to be the logical given reducing pesticides coming through. If DEFRA were to move to tuber indexing as well as crop inspections, could this support oil use after T1?
Yeah, there's probably 2 separate aspects really there. I mean, in terms of the approvals, it has to go through. It's not really down to the level of virus. It is down to the efficacy, but it's obviously down to the phyto or down to the environmental profile of the oils. That's where the challenge is to get it through the approval process. And I think there's 2 potentially that are trying to get through that process at the moment. I think we need to support them as much as we can, and whether it's certainly AHDB presenting the side, we need to support these approvals on seed crops. They're not going to be used widely, they're going to be used on seed crops. And as Jim said earlier, we're going away from these dual crops. A seed crop is a seed crop, and the other insecticides we're using mean we can't use it that have a dual crop. So everything we can do to support it. But then if you go down to tuber indexing, everything that we do in East Anglia, we do test ourselves in-house. We have to, because the levels of virus, as you can see from the crops. So we do test everything. Whether it becomes part of the certification scheme, well, that's up to debate.
Yeah, and sticking on the mineral side of things, I guess, Jim, as well, you did some work on oils. Have you seen any differences between potato varieties in their susceptibility to phytotoxicity effects from repeated?
We didn't see any effects at all, but we actually used it. That's the first. Last year was the first season we've used oils, so we actually used the T1 because the crop wasn't fully immersed, and then we went on with a pyrethroid the second time, and with a neonic, and then oil again, but we were restricted up to tuber initiation, so we only used 2 applications last season. So it definitely helped us extend the other systemic insecticides that we're using a little bit further into the season. You know, thinking about the infection that came into the previous year's crop right at the end. So, you know, we're always focused on controlling aphids as the crop's coming through the ground when they're at their most susceptible, but you can't forget about the back end either. If you know, if you're desiccating a crop when it's not coming down, these potatoes can, if there's regrowth, they can be exposed for another 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, and just talking about early on in the season, question for you, Graham. Do you think the use of pyrethroids early on is having an adverse effect on beneficials?
I think there's no doubt it will have an adverse effect. We've felt in the past that the beneficial effect outweighs the effect on the beneficial aspect on the killing the aphids has outweighed the downside on the beneficials. But as I raised in my presentation, I severely question that now, given the aphid species that are out there, and I think we're looking maybe to use a lot less, if at all, in programs going forward. So yeah, it definitely hits beneficials, there's no doubt.
And there's a question, I'll direct this one at Mike, more on the sort of operating side of things. I mean, how do you ensure even coverage with your insecticide sprays? Any tips on sort of water volume, nozzle selection?
That's a good question. Generally, we are using molecular IDTA 05 nozzles or 08 nozzles. So, yeah, angled nozzles, but varying angle and varying percentage of flow from the front and the rear of the nozzle. They tend, in our experience, to give us the best distribution, you know, around the canopy. We've tried various others, but we've used water sensitive paper, and to be honest, the molecular IDTAs have probably given us the best deposition across, you know, the biggest range of leaves and stems.
Yeah. And to you, Jim, have you sort of found the same thing? Angled nozzles, higher walls?
We use varied, you know, obviously when you're at a small target, we're at 200 litres per hectare, but then as the season goes on, we go 250, 300 for blight and insecticide. We actually tend to use a 3D nozzle because it's a finer spray. It really depends on the weather. We use the Lechlers if it's windy for blight and insecticides, but we tend to stick with a standard nozzle for blight and insecticide application. But we're on a much smaller scale than Mike, so we can pick and choose the time that we'll spray.
Yeah. Then switching it up a bit for Graham, have you looked at the amount of virus in 3-row beds versus rows? Maybe better contrast in rows.
I mean, we haven't looked at the difference between 3 rows and 2s. At Mike's, it's all 3-row beds, but given the work on straw mulch and the contrast, and you know, if you can remove that soil colour quickly, more quickly, then you might reduce aphids landing in the crop. So you would expect that a 3-row bed might be beneficial with that regard. but that hasn't been, as far as I'm aware, that hasn't actually been researched.
And is there any risk of spreading PVY by flailing?
Again, that's an area we always feel there may be a risk, and that is one aspect I wondered with this trial, because it was flailed off for desiccation. Did that move PVY amongst plots when you're going closely in plots? So that is another aspect that we may need to look at next year. So there is a potential for that. I haven't again seen scientific data to back that potential up.
And Jim, have you got any thoughts on that? I mean, you don't flail, do you? You're a three-spray crop.
Yeah, you know, for me, the potential's there to spread virus and bacteria with a flail and a seed crop. So for me, the answer would be yes. And we're really conscious. So, Maureen, one of the varieties that we grow for McCain potato, is one of our partners in this as well, is very susceptible to PVYN. And PVYN is actually not very easy to rogue out, especially early dose. And we did have a stock this year that had a very small percentage, but the tubers underneath them, because most of them were taken out prior to second inspection, they were all monkey faced. You know, obviously, if we're a grower in the south, they get seed with a high percentage of PVYN in it. You know, I can understand that they're not going to be happy. So we're very conscious to try and keep that virus out of the crops. So, you know, flailing is, you know, it's a risk. You know, if you look at it as from a risk point of view, I don't think you should be using it in a seed crop, but that's a personal view.
Yeah, and moving on to Mike, question here. On the previous webinar, you mentioned organic. How do you manage the aphids on your organic land?
Well, outside of potato crops, as Graham said, then essentially we're quite reliant on crop covers, so particularly fleece, poly, and then net during the later part of the season, and we're using that for our most sensitive crops, really predominantly carrots, really. From a potato point of view, we're obviously not growing seed potatoes organically. I like a challenge, but not quite that much. But yeah, growing potatoes, ware potatoes organically, then we don't really have many effective applications or such, or approved products, and which something we're not generally not doing. What we are, I think, benefiting from is probably we have more beneficials in the crop. We have more beneficials in the organic environment from surrounding organic crops, surrounding organic fields, surrounding organic hedgerows. So I think that's where we really benefit. And, you know, I think the effect of beneficials within a crop, we've seen it many times within the organics, particularly of carrot crops, where you can get a very high influx of aphids, and quite rapidly you can have a very, very rapid, very effective buildup of predators. And it's amazing to watch. You know, when you get down on your hands and knees and actually observe it, it's impressive.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Bring some tactics from there into the conventional system.
Definitely.
Just one to sort of round up for maybe Graham is looking into this season. Do you think we've had enough frosty days and nights this winter to affect the early season aphid numbers, or could we be in a bit of a tricky situation?
Probably up north. There's certainly been colder weather, which may well have affected, you know, the number that will carry over. With us, we haven't had that much cold weather yet down here. I think a lot of the build-up goes down to early season. I mean, if you look at last year, massive numbers, but we had a very bright, sort of nice weather during that COVID lockdown period, and hence the aphid numbers built up very rapidly. So quite often, if you get a wet week or 2 weeks as that build-up is occurring, it will slow it down. So I think it's more down to the actual individual season than the previous winter. That winter will have an effect, but to me, it's the season itself. If we get wet periods in that build-up, the predators can catch up quicker than the aphids. If it's just continual lovely weather for the aphids, then we get the big spikes.
Yeah, and then one last one will go from Mark Stallam. So low seed grade in a separate field to high seed grade. Don't mix variable quality seed lots in one field. Is this correct? Would shelter belts help if you can't do this?
So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Mark's comment there. As we pulled out, you know, you're only good at in a mixed field with different seed lots. You're only good as your lowest common denominator. You know, no good putting pre-basic seed and then having a much lower grade around the headland. Shelter belts might help if you were trying to split up two blocks. If you couldn't go away from that, but certainly we try and plan seed lots accordingly. We wouldn't try and mix. We'll plan on fields to try and make sure we've got the least risk. So yeah, try and plan it. Shelter belt might help. Don't know if there's any work on that, but you can't see why it wouldn't help in between, but that's not always easy to do.
That's good, thank you. So I think that wraps up our time, 17 minutes over, but any questions not answered, we'll get back to you. I'd like to obviously thank all the attendees and all the speakers today for coming and talking about, you know, their work and their experiences, and I look forward to seeing what goes on next year. And then obviously please remember to apply for your basis points and Enroso points. The code is just up on screen now, and complete that on the form on the main reception page. So we hope you enjoyed this session, and please join us for the next session today at 12 till 1 on managing sprout suppression without CIPC. Thank you and see you there.